Elizabeth Carter had always believed in the quiet strength of her life, in the gentle rhythm of days spent caring for her family, raising her children, and keeping the household running smoothly. At 58, she looked back at over 3 decades of dedication, of sleepless nights and endless mornings, and she felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. She had given herself completely to her husband Henry and their 2 children, always assuming that the life she was building with him was grounded in love, trust, and mutual respect. The morning of her son David's wedding arrived with a soft golden light spilling into their home. The house was alive with the buzz of excitement, laughter, and nervous anticipation. Elizabeth moved from room to room, checking that everything was perfect, her hands automatically smoothing wrinkles in tablecloths and adjusting floral arrangements. Henry, usually bustling in the kitchen or distracted by last-minute wedding arrangements, seemed oddly distant. Elizabeth noticed the subtle glance he cast at his phone, the way he answered messages with hurried attention, the small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Something in the pit of her stomach tightened, but she pushed it aside. Today was not the day to confront old suspicions. Today was David's day. The ceremony went smoothly. David looked radiant in his tuxedo, holding the hand of his new wife, Emily, who was radiant with joy. The reception that followed was elegant, filled with friends and family, clinking glasses, and the warm glow of celebration. Elizabeth smiled, her heart full, knowing that all her careful planning and attention to detail had created a day that her son would never forget. She glanced at Henry, expecting the usual warm smile of pride, but instead, she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Anticipation, impatience, a secret waiting to erupt. And then it happened. The words came out of him like a knife slicing through the laughter and music. "This is the end for us. I've found someone new." The room fell silent, a heavy hush descending as every head turned toward them. Conversations froze mid-sentence, glasses paused in the air, and the clinking of silverware ceased. Elizabeth felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She had anticipated this moment, had expected it, and had planned for it meticulously. Henry's secretary, a woman named Clara, sat across from her with a smug smile, fully aware that the drama she had witnessed unfold was no accident. Elizabeth let the words wash over her like a wave she had learned to ride rather than drown in. She took a deep breath and reached into her purse, pulling out a crisp white envelope. She placed it deliberately in front of Henry, her movements calm, controlled, almost serene. "What's that?" he demanded, his voice faltering as the first cracks of doubt began to appear. "Just a little something for you to look at later," Elizabeth replied, her voice even measured. She turned to her son, who sat frozen in shock, and brushed his cheek gently. "Don't let anyone ruin this day for you, sweetheart. This is your moment." And then she walked away. The guests watched in stunned silence as she left the room, her blue dress gliding effortlessly across the floor, her head held high, every step a declaration of quiet strength. The doors closed behind her, and she finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. Outside in the hotel hallway, she could feel the tension of the evening unraveling, and she smiled, knowing that the real reckoning was yet to come. 6 months ago, Elizabeth had noticed small discrepancies in their finances. Henry, always charming and persuasive, had convinced her that everything was fine. But Elizabeth, with a sharp mind honed from 25 years in banking, had begun to investigate. She discovered a secret account, a trail of money moving stealthily away from their joint savings, and messages on Henry's phone that betrayed the depth of his betrayal. Every dinner, every party, every casual conversation with Clara had been a calculated move in a long game of deception. Elizabeth's heart had broken in silence, but her mind was already formulating a plan. She consulted lawyers, documented every transaction, and prepared meticulously. When Henry thought he was orchestrating the ultimate humiliation at their son's wedding, Elizabeth had already set the pieces in motion. Divorce papers were filed, bank accounts frozen, and a legal strategy carefully constructed to ensure that every act of betrayal would be met with consequence. Henry had believed himself clever, unstoppable. He had not accounted for Elizabeth's patience, her foresight, or her capacity for quiet fury. As she walked toward the elevator, she felt a strange liberation, a sense of justice that was both intoxicating and serene. The confrontation was inevitable, but she would meet it on her terms, with calm and precision. Henry stormed after her moments later, disbelief etched across his face. "What did you do?" he shouted, his earlier composure gone, replaced by panic and confusion. Elizabeth didn't break her stride. She didn't need to explain. He would understand soon enough. The envelope contained the first part of her plan, a small taste of the storm she had prepared. She drove home to their house on Willow Lane, a home she had helped build, a home that had been filled with laughter, arguments, celebrations, and quiet nights. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. She knew Henry was ready to leave, ready to claim a future with Clara, but she also knew that he had underestimated her completely. As she stepped inside, the weight of years of patience and quiet observation settled around her like a cloak. She allowed herself a small, private smile. Today was not the end of her life. Today was the beginning of a chapter she had long imagined, but never allowed herself to write. She poured a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened her laptop. Legal documents, evidence of betrayal, meticulous notes, all of it laid out before her. And she was calm. When Henry arrived later, furious and disoriented, she met his anger with serenity. Words were exchanged, accusations flung, threats made, but Elizabeth was unshaken. Her preparation, her foresight, her meticulous planning had given her a shield no tantrum or manipulation could penetrate. The house that had once been a stage for his control was now her domain of power. Every secret he had thought hidden was now laid bare, and the consequences of his choices were inevitable. Her son arrived shortly after, still in his wedding attire, looking exhausted but determined to stand by her side. Elizabeth embraced him, whispered reassurances, and let him witness the strength of a woman who had been underestimated for decades. Together, they would face the storm, but Elizabeth knew one truth above all. Betrayal could not destroy the spirit of someone who had spent years quietly building resilience, insight, and justice. The evening ended not with chaos, but with the quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. Henry's world began to crumble in ways he had never imagined, while Elizabeth stood poised on the threshold of a new life, a life defined not by the betrayals she had endured, but by the wisdom, courage, and foresight that had finally brought her freedom. Elizabeth awoke the next morning with a quiet resolve that had settled over her like the first light of dawn. The chaos of the wedding night, Henry's betrayal, and the public spectacle he had tried to create now felt distant, almost unreal, yet the weight of what had to be done pressed steadily on her. She brewed a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands and her mind, steadying her for the day ahead. The documents she had prepared, every bank statement, every message, every legal note, lay spread across the table like a roadmap to justice. Henry, predictably, was frantic. He had spent the night pacing, calling lawyers, and trying desperately to undo what he thought was a simple embarrassment. Elizabeth knew him too well. He always believed charm could solve everything, that truth was negotiable, and that his schemes were untouchable. But this time, patience, preparation, and intelligence had tilted the balance entirely in her favor. She had built a fortress of evidence that even his clever mind could not breach. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed with a message from David. His tone was careful, wary but supportive. "Mom, I'm coming over. I need to see you." Elizabeth smiled softly, touched by the unspoken loyalty. David had always been observant, kind, and perceptive, and he now stood firmly on the side of justice, even when it involved his own father. She replied simply, "I'll be here. Don't worry about anything else." Within the hour, David arrived, still in the remnants of his wedding attire, eyes tired but resolute. He hugged her tightly, a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering shock in his embrace. "Why didn't you tell me before the wedding?" he asked, his voice low, almost trembling. Elizabeth shook her head gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. You worked so hard for this day. I couldn't let him ruin it for you. Some battles must be fought carefully, in silence, until the right moment comes. David's eyes softened with understanding, but the worry remained. He had seen the chaos, the stunned faces, and he knew just how meticulously Henry had planned his humiliation. Elizabeth guided him to the kitchen table, where she began to explain everything: the months of observation, the secret accounts, the messages, the lavish gifts, the hidden plans. She told him about Clara, the woman Henry believed could share his life and betray hers, and how she had been preparing for every step, anticipating every move, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. David listened intently, absorbing every word, the shock on his face gradually giving way to admiration. "Mom, you are amazing," he said finally, voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you stayed so calm, so composed." Elizabeth smiled faintly, her heart both heavy and light. "Calm doesn't mean unfeeling, David. Calm is the armor that allows you to strike precisely when the time is right." Later that day, Henry arrived at the house, urgency etched across his face, a mixture of anger and disbelief radiating from his every gesture. He barged into the living room, voice raised, demanding explanations, desperate to reclaim control over the narrative he thought he had mastered. Elizabeth sat calmly, her posture relaxed, her expression serene, as if the storm he carried could not touch her. "You can't do this," he shouted, waving the envelope and the documents that had crushed his carefully constructed world. "This is my life, my reputation. You can't just—" "I can," Elizabeth interrupted softly, her voice carrying a quiet finality that cut through his bluster. "And I did. Every detail, every step, every contingency was accounted for months ago. This isn't about punishment. This is about truth, about integrity, about reclaiming what was taken under pretenses." Henry's panic deepened, but Elizabeth's calm only strengthened. She laid out the facts, presenting the evidence with precision, explaining how every financial transfer, every secret arrangement, every whispered plan had been documented and prepared for legal scrutiny. She explained that the divorce papers had been filed, the joint accounts frozen, and that a legal hearing was scheduled within days. Henry's face drained of color, the confident mask he wore for decades slipping away to reveal the vulnerability and desperation beneath. The confrontation grew tense, every word weighted with the significance of decades of betrayal, secrecy, and deceit. Clara, who had followed Henry in a mix of curiosity and blind confidence, realized for the first time that the story she had been told was only half the truth. Her own admiration for Henry faltered as she witnessed the precision with which Elizabeth dismantled his schemes, her intelligence and foresight leaving no space for charm or manipulation. Elizabeth's strategy was methodical. She allowed Henry to flounder, exposed the gaps in his plan, and ensured that every detail was verified and documented. David stood beside her, his presence a reminder of what was at stake: family, integrity, and the lessons of truth. Henry tried every tactic he knew, pleading, arguing, blaming, gaslighting. But Elizabeth remained unshaken, her voice calm, her focus unwavering. By late afternoon, the tension in the house had shifted. Henry's energy, once dominating and threatening, had become erratic and unmoored. Elizabeth had anticipated this outcome, understanding that panic and desperation were more dangerous than calculated fury. Every move she made was precise, every reaction measured, ensuring that the evidence she presented would be indisputable when the court convened. As evening approached, Elizabeth and David sat together in quiet reflection, sipping tea and reviewing the day's events. "Mom, I was scared," David admitted softly. "I didn't know how this could unfold. But you turned it around." Elizabeth reached out, brushing his hair back, her touch gentle but firm. Strength isn't about avoiding fear. It's about acting despite it, with clarity, with patience, with foresight. The night deepened, and Elizabeth allowed herself a brief moment of solitude. She walked through the house, observing the spaces that had been witness to years of love, compromise, and now, betrayal. Memories surfaced: laughter, celebrations, quiet conversations in the kitchen, but they were no longer a chain. They were a foundation, a testament to the life she had built, a life she could now reclaim and reshape. Henry retreated to a guest room, his plans unraveling faster than he could comprehend. Clara left quietly, her assumptions about loyalty and love shattered. The house, once a stage for his manipulations, had become Elizabeth's fortress of truth, order, and impending justice. She knew the court would see the evidence, understand the deception, and uphold the agreements that had been meticulously structured to protect her and her family. Elizabeth's mind drifted briefly to the future. She envisioned the bakery she had postponed for decades, the small office downtown where she would finally pursue her dream. She imagined a life where her intelligence, foresight, and resilience could flourish freely, unbound by betrayal or false loyalties. The thought brought a soft smile to her face, a mixture of triumph, hope, and quiet satisfaction. As the house settled into a tense but controlled quiet, Elizabeth felt a sense of completion. The confrontation had been managed, the storm contained, and the path forward clear. She knew the court proceedings would require focus, patience, and steadfastness, but she was ready. She had spent months preparing, and now, all that preparation would bear fruit. Justice, as she understood it, was not swift, but it was inevitable when approached with clarity, patience, and meticulous care. And so, the night stretched on. Elizabeth seated at the kitchen table, documents arranged neatly, tea cooling in her cup, a deep sense of calm settling in. Tomorrow, the legal battle would begin. Tomorrow, decades of betrayal would be tested against the meticulous planning and intelligence of a woman who had spent her life quietly building strength, insight, and unshakable resolve. She took a deep breath, the weight of anticipation tempered by the satisfaction of readiness, and allowed herself to feel, for the first time in years, that the future, her future, was entirely, beautifully, hers. The morning of the court hearing arrived shrouded in gray clouds that seemed to mirror the tension that had gripped Elizabeth's world for months. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft navy suit that exuded calm authority without a hint of aggression. Her hair was neatly arranged, her makeup minimal, her expression serene, yet beneath it, a quiet storm of anticipation and resolve raged. David walked beside her, protective yet respectful, a silent pillar of support. Together, they entered the small courthouse, a place that would soon witness the unraveling of decades of deceit. Henry arrived shortly after, flanked by a young lawyer whose uncertainty was palpable. The man had experience in corporate law, not divorce or family disputes, and it showed in every hesitant gesture, every faltering sentence. Henry, confident in his perceived cleverness, had not anticipated the thoroughness of Elizabeth's preparation, nor the precision of her evidence. As they entered the courtroom, the air was thick with tension, every breath laden with the weight of history, betrayal, and impending justice. The judge, an older woman with eyes sharp enough to pierce pretense, wasted no time. She examined the documents laid before her, scanning the meticulously organized evidence that Elizabeth had compiled. Bank statements, secret accounts, text messages, photographs of gifts purchased in secrecy, records of transactions, all spoke a clear truth. Henry had been dishonest, deceitful, and disloyal. Elizabeth presented her case with calm authority, her voice steady, her words deliberate. Every question was answered with precision, every document verified, every detail accounted for. Henry's protests grew desperate, each interruption a testament to the unraveling of his plan. "Your Honor, the agreement is outdated. It doesn't apply anymore," he argued, voice rising in frustration. Elizabeth's lawyer, David Chen, smiled faintly, and Elizabeth herself shook her head with quiet certainty. The judge raised a hand, silencing the courtroom with a mere glance. "Section 15 and Section 28 are clearly in effect," she stated, her tone leaving no room for ambiguity. "The fidelity clause applies, and the evidence of financial misconduct is substantial. The freeze on joint accounts will remain, and the family home stays in Mrs. Carter's possession until the conclusion of proceedings." Henry's face went pale. He turned to his lawyer, seeking guidance, but the young man's discomfort mirrored his own rising panic. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the reality of Henry's situation sank in. The carefully constructed image of a devoted husband, a pillar of the community, and a successful businessman had begun to crumble. Every lie, every deceitful maneuver, every whispered promise made in secret was now laid bare under the scrutiny of law and truth. Elizabeth remained composed, her gaze steady, her presence commanding without ever raising her voice. She felt the weight of decades of loyalty, sacrifice, and intelligence converge into this moment. She had anticipated every move, every argument, every desperate attempt at manipulation, and she met each with the calm authority of someone who had long prepared for this exact confrontation. The judge, reviewing the final evidence, made her ruling. The marriage agreement is valid and enforceable. Mr. Carter's personal account will remain accessible for basic living expenses, but the joint accounts are frozen. The family home remains with Mrs. Carter. The financial misconduct and breach of fidelity will be considered in the final settlement. Elizabeth felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through preparation, insight, and patience. Henry left the courtroom in a storm of frustration and disbelief, his plans for a secret life with Clara in ruins. Clara, realizing the instability of their carefully imagined future, had already begun to distance herself, her confidence shaken by the reality of the evidence. Outside, Elizabeth stood with David, watching the aftermath unfold, a sense of quiet triumph settling over her. She had anticipated every possibility, prepared for every contingency, and now, the consequences of deception were fully visible. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth began the process of rebuilding her life with deliberate care. She rented a small, charming office downtown and opened the bakery she had long dreamed of. The first customers were neighbors who remembered her homemade cookies from school fundraisers, and word of mouth brought a growing stream of patrons. Custom cakes, wedding orders, birthday celebrations. Elizabeth found herself immersed in work that was both fulfilling and joyful. The financial security she had maintained separately gave her freedom and confidence, and every successful order, every smiling customer, became a small affirmation of her reclaimed life. David, moving to Atlanta for his marketing career, kept in regular contact, proud and supportive of the path his mother had carved for herself. "Mom, you're finally doing what makes you happy," he said one evening over the phone. Elizabeth smiled, realizing that the years of delayed dreams had only sharpened her focus and resolve. "I'm finally living the life I should have started decades ago," she replied softly, the warmth in her voice carrying the weight of years of endurance and wisdom. Henry, meanwhile, struggled to maintain the image of success he had so carefully curated. His business faltered without Elizabeth's guidance. The promises he had made to Clara dissolved under the reality of financial instability, and his reputation in the community deteriorated rapidly. He moved to a modest apartment, his wealth diminished, his plans for a shared life with Clara evaporated. The justice that Elizabeth had orchestrated through careful preparation had reshaped not only her life, but also the world of those who had underestimated her. Months later, the final court hearing concluded. The judge upheld the terms of the divorce completely. Elizabeth retained the family home, the majority of the joint investments, and her personal retirement accounts. Henry left with only his personal belongings and the limited funds in his own account, a tangible reminder of the consequences of deception and betrayal. The fidelity clause, the very agreement he had once insisted upon to protect his assets, had become his ultimate downfall. Elizabeth watched the final chapter of this story close with a quiet heart, her mind already envisioning the future she would now build without constraint. Her bakery flourished, her independence secured, and her life, once defined by the needs and whims of others, was now fully her own. She allowed herself the rare luxury of reflection, recognizing the resilience she had cultivated over decades of challenge, patience, and quiet intelligence. Family and friends rallied around her, offering support, encouragement, and genuine affection. David's voice, filled with pride and love, reminded her daily of the legacy of strength, integrity, and wisdom she had imparted. The house, once a stage for betrayal, had become a sanctuary of clarity, accomplishment, and reclaimed dignity. Elizabeth knew, with the serene certainty that comes from foresight and preparation, that life would continue to offer challenges. But she also knew, more firmly than ever, that she possessed the strength, insight, and resilience to face whatever came next. The future, once shadowed by deceit and disappointment, now gleamed with the promise of autonomy, fulfillment, and the quiet, enduring joy of a life lived fully, wisely, and on her own terms. Standing in her kitchen one evening, sipping tea as the last light of the sun painted the walls with a soft glow, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of peace. The past had been conquered not through rage, but through patience, foresight, and strategic action. Her life, rebuilt from the careful ruins of betrayal, now carried a clarity and purpose she had only ever imagined. Every decision, every step, every action had led her here, to a place where freedom, justice, and fulfillment intertwined seamlessly. The story of betrayal, deception, and ultimate triumph became a quiet legend within her circle, whispered with admiration and respect. Elizabeth's life, once defined by the care of others, had transformed into a life defined by her own intelligence, determination, and wisdom. And as she looked toward the horizon of her future, she knew that this ending was truly the beginning, a new chapter filled with possibilities, guided by the lessons of the past, and embraced with the strength of a woman who had finally reclaimed her life entirely.